One of the things that I think always comes to my mind at times like these is we always, when we talk about and we reminisce, we usually reminisce about the good times, don't we? It's always good to sit around, fellowship with other people, and talk about all the good times that have happened, right? You know, there's even a time when, as we think about as families, we think about the times where we had the chance to have a lot. I mean, in these particular times, one of the things that people are struggling with more than anything is learning how to deal with our resources, whether we have a little or a lot. And we all love to be in the place where we're in the lot. You know, it's easy. It's better to live in the lot. And when I say live in the lot, I don't necessarily mean that we're rich. I don't necessarily mean that we have all these things to give and all these things to do. What I am saying is this: we are in a place where we are lacking nothing, and the Lord is taking care of us. It's good to reminisce on those times. In fact, some of us, we become extravagant in those times, where when we see the Lord has given us a lot, we do a lot more. We can reminisce on the times where the Lord has blessed us, on the times where the Lord has given us much more, and we talk about what we did with it and how He used it and what it meant to us. But man, some of the toughest times to ever live through are the times when we have little. The times where we had to struggle to get what we have. Well, in the times where we remember the sacrifice that it costs to get the thing that we have, just to have all that we need. Whether we're in the time of little or a lot, we're all struggling at this moment. As we are all huddled together and whether it's in a safer at home ordinance or just quarantining from the coronavirus, we are all in a place right now where we are all facing some sort of place where we are living in the little, where we are lacking, where we are struggling to figure out how much we have of what we need. And when I say this, I am not talking about simply just having enough money, although that is important, having enough money to do the things we need to do. What I'm also referring to is this. For many of us, we are stuck at home because we've lost jobs, and now we're having to figure out how to live on what we have. That can be living in the little. For some of us, it's adjusting our lifestyles where maybe a parent has to go to work and has to be an essential worker in a time where they're worried about their loved one contracting the coronavirus and bringing it home and infecting others. And we're trying to figure out how to deal with what is going on. That's living in the little and the drought. For some of us, we are used to being social beings who are out and about and having many conversations, hanging out with people, whether at restaurants and other places that frequent social gatherings. But now you're quarantined in and you're having to figure out how to deal with not being able to see this person face to face in fellowship. And you're lacking in the area of social interactions. That could be your drought. But make no mistake about this, no matter what type of drought that we live through, God wants us not to focus in on what causes us to struggle. In fact, let me say that in a different way. In times of struggle, we usually find ourselves trying to figure out how we can make up the deficit for what we do not have. And then when we do that, we find ourselves trying to find resources to make up those means. But sometimes we get so wrapped up in trying to find the resources for the means that we have that we forget the source of our means. And so what I'm asking is this: what do you do? It's easy when we live in the lot, but what do you do when we live in the time and the period of the little? What do you do when you don't have enough? You know, for some people, it causes us to turn and become selfish. It turns us to being hoarders, people who are only concerned about self and no one else. If you don't believe me, look no further than your local Walmart aisle where there is no tissue. All of a sudden, we go from these people who are content with what we have to all of a sudden, we start gathering and hoarding and only caring about self. And we forget that there are other people around us who have needs and need to be tended to as well. What do you do when you don't have enough? What do you do when you don't have enough? Do you look for resources, or do you look for the source of all of our needs? You see, in today's story, in 1 Kings chapter 17, let me set the backdrop for this. You see, if you have to go back, and you can do this after the sermon, but in 1 Kings chapter 16, we notice that there is a new king who is being enacted as the king of Israel. His name is Ahab. Now, me personally, when I read if I was ever in the Bible, I would want there to be the best possible statement about me as I could be. Even though I'm not a perfect man by any stretch, I would want the best possible statement about me to start off my life story in the Bible. I'm sure you would too. But when you start reading about this new king Ahab in chapter 16, starting around verse 30, it begins in the worst possible way. It says that King Ahab became king of Israel, and he was king of Israel for about 22 years. But then it has one summary statement that explains what his reign was like. It says that, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, much more than others before him. That's a bad start to a kingdom, isn't it? You see, Ahab became king, and the first thing that he did was he fell into idols. He started worshiping Baal, which was the storm god, the one who brought rain in the Canaanite culture and several other cultures. And they also started worshiping Baal's girlfriend, Asherah. Asherah was the god of fertility. So they would pray to Baal that he would bring the rain, and that Asherah would cause the growth of fertility so that the land would grow and so that they would be blessed. And so Ahab not only brought himself and his wife into this idol worship, they brought the kingdom of Israel along with them. And so now, and as always, whenever the prophet of God is stepping into a situation, it's usually because people are out of line. And that is where the prophet, Elijah, is having to step into this situation. At the very beginning of 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1, Elijah is calling Ahab to the carpet. Essentially, he says this. He basically says, listen, I live, as long as the Lord your God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next years. You see, the judgment that Elijah is pronouncing upon Ahab and the kingdom of Israel is because they have gone astray. They have done idol worship. The problem here is idolatry. Now, I want you to notice something, and I'm giving you this outside of my notes here, is the fact that, listen, whenever we get caught up in false idols and false gods, God always judges us and calls us back to his attention. And for the kingdom of Israel, he called them back to attention by saying, listen, you believe in the fertility God. You believe that he is the one, or she is the one who causes the rain to come and for things to grow. Well, that's not true. And I'm going to prove it by cutting off your rain. And the rain won't come until I say it comes. Whenever we get caught up in false idols, and let me go back and say this. You may look and you say, well, Reggie, we don't worship false idols. Well, we do. We call them American idols. We worship celebrities. If they talk well, we get on Facebook and we share their thoughts as our own. We camp ourselves together with other people, and we go and we ride so much for them that we sometimes do it to the point where we lose credibility. We find ourselves in places where we're so enamored by this person and their thoughts and their ideology that we forget sometimes that we even represent God. And like Brother Jeff said a couple of weeks ago, we even ruin our testimony because of it. And so God calls us all, when we all fall short, he calls us away from idol worship, and he calls us into. Well, you got to imagine that when Elijah shows up and tells Ahab that he's cutting off the rain because God said so, he's not going to be the most popular guy in town. And so right after he says that, as you keep on reading in verse 2 through 7, you'll see that Elijah is now running away. He goes off into hiding, and he has to go out into the wilderness where God wants him for a season. And here in this season that God has him out in the wilderness, Elijah is getting ready to learn some life lessons about provision that he is going to need for the next phases of his journey throughout his serving God as a prophet. You see, the word of God tells us this in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 3, I should say. It tells him, it says, leave and go eastward and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. And he tells him this. He's going to give him two specific instructions here. He tells him this. When it comes to provision, he tells him two very important things. He says, number one, I want you to drink from the brook in the wilderness. That's a natural provision that God gives him. But secondly, he gives Elijah a supernatural provision as well. This brings me to my first point. When you look at the idea of provision, when you think about the idea of God providing in the drought, you have to understand this, that God's provision can come from an unlikely place. God's provision can come from an unlikely place. Perhaps for Elijah, it came in the form of a brook, a brook that's going to eventually dry up. And it also came in the form of a raven. Now, you got to understand that this is a very, very strange way for God to provide. God is telling Elijah, listen, Elijah, I'm going to send you out into the middle of nowhere where there are no provisions, and I'm going to provide everything that you need. And not only that, I'm going to provide you fresh water to drink from the brook. But then not only that, I'm going to have curbside delivery, contactless delivery service for you morning and afternoon. So in other words, God created Grubhub and Waiter before we did in this time, okay? It says that the raven brought food in the morning. In fact, it's more specifically, he brought bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening. But why would God use a bird, a raven out of all things, to get this point across, to serve and to produce this provision for Elijah? And I know you're like, okay, Reginald, why are you driving this point home so strongly? Let me tell you why. You don't have to go there now, but I challenge you to go back and look it up later. In Deuteronomy, when God pronounced certain animals to be unclean, one of the animals that were pronounced as unclean was a raven. So it almost absolutely makes no sense that God would send an unclean animal to come to a Hebrew person to deliver provision. Think about that. Imagine a pig delivering you a plate of bacon on his back and saying, bon appetit. You see, God was trying to prove a point to Elijah. Sometimes God has to use unlikely sources to bless us. But here's the thing. The one thing we must remember is this. It comes from God. God can choose to use any vehicle to bring about his deliverance or his provision as he sees fit. Nothing's off the table. And not only that, God is using this in particular to teach Elijah a lesson that's going to go along in the next couple of sentences, in the next couple of verses. So can you imagine that when this raven comes and he's holding the food, I'm sure Elijah had to be in a little bit of a panic, wondering, wait a minute, but he's unclean. And the Lord said he was unclean, but he's delivering the food. What do I do? And yet the Lord makes it clear that the raven was going to be the thing that he will use to bring provision to his household. Well, maybe for you, it's not a raven. Maybe for you, it's money from an unexpected source. Maybe for you, it's having an unlikely relationship with somebody you didn't think you would ever have a relationship with right now. Perhaps for you, maybe it's a learned lesson from an unusual event. But God, make no mistake about it, God can provide through any means he sees necessary. God can use any means he wants to get a point across and to provide all he needs for us to make it. To give you an example, let me give you an illustration. So recently I've been watching this ESPN documentary on the 97-98 Bulls called The Last Dance. And what it does is it talks about that final season of Michael Jordan and the 97-98 Bulls as they won the championship and they were dispersed. Well, of course, to understand that particular context of that story, you have to go back a few times. You have to go back into the history. Well, one of the things that they specifically flashed back to was when the Bulls hired a young coach by the name of Doug Collins. Now, Doug Collins was a departure from the previous coach of the Bulls because he was the type of person, like while the other person didn't know how to handle who we would know now as the great Michael Jordan, Doug was let Michael Jordan roam free and be able to do all that he is to become the man that he was. But now, in the very beginning, the relationship started off a little rocky. In fact, in the documentary, it tells the story of Doug, that Doug was the type of coach that when he coached with a lot of activity. So that means that he would walk around the floor and he would pace back and forth and he would be really animated and he would start sweating and he would get really hot and he'd be screaming on the court and he'd be right there on the edge of the court. And it would get to the point where he told the story of how even when he would get to the end of the game, his shirt would be soaking wet because he had been pacing back and forth and he had been moving. Well, then it gets to the end of the first game and it looks like the Bulls are about to lose. Keep in mind, he has only had limited interaction with this young prodigy named Michael Jordan. At the end of the first game, they're down by about 10 to 12 with only a couple minutes left. And Doug is trying to figure out the plays when all of a sudden this young man who would become one of the greatest basketball players of all time, Michael Jordan, comes up to him and says, first of all, what makes this unusual is this. He, the player, Michael Jordan, runs over to the bench, he grabs a cup of Gatorade and he hands it to his coach. And then he takes off his coach's coat and he says, "Hey coach, listen here, I want you to understand this. I got this. We're gonna win. You just sit back and you relax, and I promise you, we're not gonna lose this game." And so, in clear Michael Jordan fashion, he goes out, he scores the last 10 to 12 points of the game, and they win by 1 point. And the young Doug Collins, his first year coaching the Bulls, after that first game that they almost lost, he looks and he wonders what had he just seen. And so what came to mind is this. He was being provided a win and from a very unlikely source. He knew that this player was good, but he didn't think he was that good. Just like that, God can use an unusual circumstance, an unusual event, something you don't expect to bring about a change, a lesson, or something in your life that you need to know. You see, the point is this. It doesn't matter where the provision comes from if it comes from the Lord. But will you be humble enough to receive it? When you notice what the Lord is doing, will you be humble enough to accept what he's doing? So Elijah, out in the wilderness, eating from the ravens, getting constant DoorDash, right? Fast forward now, in verse 5, it tells us this. I'm sorry, in verse 7, it tells us this. Sometime later, it says that the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. You know, that happens sometimes to us. Sometimes that happens to us as believers. You know, Elijah was first in a place where even when the land was going into drought, it didn't affect him. But eventually, because the drought had come and it had gotten worse, it started affecting him. But here's the thing, it did not change the provision of the Lord. It did not change the Lord's provision for his life. But I think that's something we need to think about. You see, when God, in this particular instance, it says that later the brook dried up because there had been no rain. And then the word of the Lord came to him and he said, "Go to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." You see, sometimes God provides a provision for a limited amount of time, And sometimes to help us to move on. What am I getting at? You see, it says that the brook dried up, and right after the brook dried up, Elijah was told to go to Zarephath. And honestly, in my notes, Mandel Russell, you will appreciate this. this is your philosophy, is this. My second point is this. Follow God where he provides. If you know Mandel Russell at any amount of time, like I've known him for any amount of time, one of his favorite things to say is this: where God guides, God provides. And I can imagine him saying that right as I'm saying it right now. You see, sometimes God provides a provision for a limited amount of time, and when that time is up, that is a sign that God is going to change or do a new thing. How many of us are right now stuck in the same place, hoping that God is going to provide when God has clearly dried up the brook? There are times that we are stuck in relationships because we think that God is going to provide substance to a relationship when God has clearly dried the brook. There are times when we stay in places where we're looking for opportunities when it's clear that God has dried up the brook. When God dries up the brook, a provision in a certain place, that is a sign that we need to reevaluate. That's a sign that things may be changing. That is a sign that God may be doing a new thing. And the only choice that we have when God dries up a brook and he moves his provision is for us to follow his provision. You see, here's the thing. Notice that when he says this in these verses, God makes it clear that he dried up the brook and he says, listen, but if you go to Zarephath, there's a widow waiting on you. And this widow is going to provide for you. And so the idea here is this: when God gives provision, you follow where God is guiding, because as long as we continue to heed the word of the Lord, there will always be the provision. Let me stop and say something again right there. As long as we are in the Lord's will, God will always have provision for those who follow him. It is when we get out of the will of God, when we lack the provision that we have. Now, here's what I'm not saying. I am not saying that bad things or tough deals don't happen to Christians. They do. But what I am saying is this: for those of us who follow the Lord, who know that he has our best for us, he will always offer provision for those who follow his word and his way. You see, when God dries up certain streams in your life, whether it's revenue, whether it's relationships, whether it's opportunities, do you notice that? And not only that, if you're in that place right now where you're stuck, if you're in that place now where you're trying to figure out, are things drying up in the brook? Remember this: if you see things drying up, well then look at them and ask, Lord, where are you leading me to next? Because if the Lord does it, he has a plan in mind. He is not simply leaving you out there to hang. He wants you to follow him to the next thing. Once again, Elijah is learning a lesson that is about to come into play in the next few verses. And I want to make sure you understand the picture of what Elijah's walking into. So first of all, Elijah is on the run because he has a bounty on his head for going to tell people that he cut the rain off. Well, God cut the rain off, but he's the guy who says, God cut the water off. Well, then he's out in the wilderness, right? People are probably looking for him. Well, then the Lord sends him to Zarephath. Now, that sounds like nothing, but let me help you out here. Zarephath is the home of Jezebel. Zarephath is the center of Canaanite, Baal, and Asherah worshiping religion. So God tells him to go to King Ahab, tell him, hey, I'm cutting the water off. Oh yeah, and by the way, your next assignment is in the heart of Baal country, in the Baal Belt, not the Bible Belt, the Baal Belt, right? And you got to stay there for some time. And not only that, I'm going to have a widow take care of you. Now, you may think, okay, well, maybe this widow had money. Let me tell you, in that culture, in most culture around those times, widows were shunned. They were looked upon less than. In fact, how a person would know someone is a widow in that culture is that they would be wearing a widow's garments that show. So think about this. This woman has lost her husband. Now there's a drought. She's broke. She has a mouth to feed in her son. Oh yeah, and then the prophet of God shows up and now she got to feed him too. And not only that, Elijah, think about it, Elijah's not in any better situation. The preacher who just told off the king, who got a bounty on his head, is now showing up in the middle of Baal and Asherah country, and he's with somebody who has even less money than him, even less provisions than he has. And God specifically sent him there for a reason. You see, God's provision is there. He doesn't quite understand it yet, but God's provision is there. The story continues over in verse 12, or as we fast forward, to verse 12. It talks about the idea that when Elijah gets in the town, he's in Zarephath. He gets to the town gate and he sees a widow, and the widow's out there picking up sticks, and she's picking up sticks to get ready to have what she presumes may be her last meal. And then Elijah says hello, and he says, listen, will you get me a drink of water? Keep in mind, when Elijah shows up in town, he knows it's a widow, but he doesn't know who it is. And so he asks for a drink of water. Well, then he has to discern whether or not this widow is the widow that the Lord has told him to get to or not. Well, imagine this widow who was told by God, hey, the prophet's coming to you, and you need to serve him. You need to serve him as much as you can. And so then Elijah shows up, and she begins to serve him water, and he says, listen, will you get me a drink of water? And she gets ready to run off and says, oh, sure, I'll do that. And then he says, oh yeah, make me some bread. And go, ooh, wait a minute. He wants bread. You see, the widow of Zarephath, she makes it clear that she doesn't have much. And now the prophet of God is coming to her and asking her for her last. And you know what? She's afraid. How many of you are out there in the middle of this quarantine, in the middle of this coronavirus pandemic? You have been laid off of work, or you're working a lot less than you used to. And you keep hoping that the next week we're going to go back to work, or that you can find some extra work to keep making money so that ends meet, so that you can continue to thrive. But yet, as you look in your cupboards, they're getting slim. As you look in your bank account, the number's getting lower. As you look around, you see people are getting restless, and you are worried, anxious, and afraid. And then all of a sudden, somebody comes to your door and says, listen, I need your last. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine being told by God, being told by the prophet, listen, I need you to give me the last of the little that you have? And yet Elijah knows what he's meant to do to work on behalf of the Lord. And so he challenges her faith, which leads me to my third point here. In the midst of the drought, God's provision comes when we're obedient to God first. When we're obedient to God first. You see, because the widow of Zarephath could have easily just said, you know what? Hey, in any other circumstance, I would love to give you this bread, and I would love to fix you, use my oil and my flour to make you bread. But let me be honest with you, I don't have much, and I'm looking out for me and my family. And that would have seemed perfectly valid. But for some of us, we're not necessarily in those situations, are we? For some of us, we're simply in the tough times. We become so self-centered that we can't see our own well-being as well as those around us because we're so inward focused. But let me share something with you. In times like these, in tough times, God is not calling us to be inward focused. He's calling us to be upward focused. You see, this is the time that God, via Elijah, uses the widow of Zarephath to challenge her faith. Keep in mind, she is not a God believer. She is in the midst of Baal and Asherah country. She has been told by God that she doesn't serve the man of God. And what we see even in verse 12 and 13 is that she even begins to recognize Elijah's God as the God. Now, Elijah is getting down to nitty-gritty, and he's testing her and challenging her. Keep in mind, this woman, by all accounts, maybe because of where she's from and where she lives, she is used to praying to the god of Baal, to the god of Asherah. And when they pray, rain comes down and things grow up. But now that belief is being challenged. That belief is being challenged. She's being challenged to take a new route, to serve and live for the Lord our God. You see, God wants us to exercise faith and receive the provision that we want. You see, when we're stuck in these times of drought, it's easy to just be stuck in a place where we're only concerned about number one and the people around our table. But this is the time where we're able to show how much we love Jesus by sharing, serving, caring, and checking on others. You see, let me put it in a different way. In fact, let me help you understand this by helping you to understand who helped me understand this point. My son RJ helped me craft this point for this sermon. Let me tell you how he did that. If your kid is like my child, they've had trouble sleeping throughout this pandemic. Their days are mixed up because we're trying to wear them out and we're trying to get all the energy out. But in the end, they're staying up and they're trying to figure out, all they can do to spend their energy and be engaged in all these different things. So last night I'm sitting in my office toiling over this sermon, and RJ walks in and he says, "Daddy, can I help you?" Now, little did he know that Daddy had just prayed to the Lord again, said, "Lord, I need you to help me figure out what to do in this sermon. I'm lost, Lord. I don't know what to do." And the Lord sends my son into the room, and my son, RJ, says, "Daddy, how can I help you?" Well, here's the other part of it too. My son was also tired. He wanted rest, but he was feeling really antsy. And he wanted somebody to snuggle up with and get comfort. And the reason why I bring that up is this. You see, those who provide will be provided for. You see, my son could have just came in and just said, "Dad, I'm sleepy," and started whining and started complaining. And I could have said, "I'm trying to get this sermon straight. And, I don't, just go in there and, do what you can, or go see your mom," or something like that, right? But instead, I met his need. And by him coming in and asking, "Can I help you?" he helped to meet my need in understanding this point. You see, he got up in my lap as I was sitting at my computer. He curled up next to me, and I was reading a book and trying to watch a video just for some extra resources. And guess what? He began to get the rest that he needed, and I began to get the clarity on what God wanted me to say to you. You see, one of the things that we don't understand sometimes is that in the times of drought, the best way for us to respond is to provide for others so that God will provide for us. You see, back in the story, Elijah provided, when we read on the story, we see that Elijah with the widow, he went to her. He said, "Listen, bake this bread for me, this cake for me, and I promise you the Lord is not going to make sure that your cupboard never runs dry," right? And so that's what she did. Now keep in mind, she was reluctant, but she followed the word of the Lord. Well, then, for Elijah, it was the food and the drink that he needed. For her, it was the resources she needed to keep her family alive. As Elijah provided for her, the widow provided for him. God uses us to provide for others, and in turn, they provide for us. Now, if you think that's crazy, if you think I'm just way offline, let me read a New Testament scripture to you in Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6, verse 38. Here's what it says. Words of Jesus. "Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. And with good measure you use, it will be measured to you." You see, in times like this, we find ourselves being inwardly focused. We find ourselves wanting provision, whether it's in revenue, whether it's in relationships, or whether it's any other type of opportunities. We find ourselves seeking these things, but becoming inwardly focused. Or the Lord tells us in the midst of a drought, we need to look around and recognize our surroundings and say, I need to be looking for the unusual things that the Lord may use to bless me. He also says this. He also says, listen, wherever I put the provision is where you need to be. But more importantly, as you provide for others, I'm going to provide for you. Think about it like this. As we forgive other people, what does God provide for us? Forgiveness. As we're gracious to other people, He's gracious to us. As we take the time outside of ourselves to give to others, He in turn gives to us. God is in the business of blessing us as we bless other people. And He does it in such a way that helps us to have stronger faith. And let me end with this thought. Our God is a God of the clutch. You see, back in my old church, we used to sing a song called On Time God. And one of the lines of the song would say this, and you may have said it before, you may know this song. It says that He may not come when you want Him, but He'll be there right on time. Maybe that's where you are. Maybe you're on the edge. Maybe you're anxious. Maybe you're hoping. Maybe you're wondering if God is going to come through. Well, let me tell you, your God is going to come through in the clutch. When you need it most, He is going to provide the needs you need. But you have to trust Him. Just like the widow trusts Elijah, you have to trust Him. Just like Elijah trusted that his blessing, his need was in Zarephath with that widow, we have to trust Him. And when we trust God, He provides in such a way that we can only see His provision and know that it was Him. And maybe you say, Reggie, I haven't seen that in my personal life. Well, let me share with you one example that I have seen, and that's a part of your life and all of our lives if you're a part of Southside. Late last year, we began praying that the Lord would somehow, some way, in some fashion, whatever He could, help us to get a roof on this building. Now, we suffered. How do we know we suffered? Our garbage cans tell the stories of the multiple times staff members, volunteers, members have gone around the church picking up leaks, pouring out trash cans, vacuuming out kiddie pools, and doing all we can to keep our floors dry so that we can stay meeting together. As we got into late December, we just said, Lord, we don't know how, but we trust that You can do it. And all we knew is this, from the time that we as a church corporately prayed, and we began to, and not just prayed and stayed to ourselves, we prayed and we served other people. We continued to be outwardly focused, looking at the people in our community and saying, how can we serve You? And in turn, the Lord, He looked back at us and He began to use those situations to pour in donations, to pour in faithful tithers, to pour in people of skills and all sorts of things to begin to help us get a roof on this building. Has the journey been long? Yes, it has. Have we wished for more? Sure we have. But the Lord did it in His timing. Oh Lord, how we wish that roof had came on early fall when we put out the call. But the Lord gave us the resources. He put us in the right timing, and He did it His way. And the only conclusion that we can have from this is that He did it. We trusted in faith that the Lord would provide, and He did what He said He would do. But it was only because we were obedient and because we served others, provided for others, and He in turn provided for us. Maybe you're sitting in your house today. Maybe you're watching this on your cell phone. Maybe you're standing there and one like, Lord, it's been tough right now. This pandemic is kicking my butt. I'm depressed. I'm anxious. I don't know what else to do. Well, be of good cheer, because these are the situations that the Lord loves to intervene in. Because these are the times where we stop looking for resources and we start looking to the source of all things, and that's God. And it begins with one simple relationship, the relationship of us tapping in and connecting to the Lord. He is the creator, sustainer of the universe. He wants a relationship with you like none other. He wants to be your provider. He wants to be your leader. He wants to be your Lord, your Savior. He wants to be everything you've ever wanted. But he asks you to trade with him something very special. He says, listen, if you trade your will, trade your way, if you trade your agenda and you come and follow me, you take my purpose, you take my righteousness, you take my being, I promise you, you won't fail. I didn't say the way would be easy, but I promise you, in the end, you won't fail because I know the outcome. You win. You end up in the best place you could ever be, and you end up affecting others, and they have a chance to be the very place that you are. It begins with a relationship with the Lord. If you don't know him, now is the time to respond to him. I don't care whether you're on Facebook. If you're on our website, there are 3 buttons below our live stream, and one included says, pray to receive Jesus. Go click on that, fill that out, respond somehow. Listen, if you're in a room and you don't have anybody to talk, if you don't know what to do, connect with somebody in your room. Connect with somebody on Facebook. Let them know that, listen, you want to be saved. You want to know Jesus, and you want to get it right now. Because let me tell you, in the midst of a drought, the only thing that we have is the source of all beings, and that's the Lord. That's all we have. And my prayer is that even in the midst of this drought, you won't lose sight of what's important. And that's knowing who God is, watching him provide in his time, and watching the blessings flow from all that he's done for you. Dear Lord, God, I thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to share. God, where you've been so faithful, Lord, to us. You've been so faithful to our people. You've been so faithful to this world to continue to provide. And Lord, we just want to say thank you. Lord, there are times, God, that when we get in droughts like this, God, we become so inwardly focused that we forget about the important things. But God, help us to calibrate. Help us to focus back on you. God, we want to see the raven providing the provision we need. We want to be the resource to the widow of Zarephath, Lord. And we want to be able to point to you and know, Lord, that it's only because of you that we have this provision. God, let us be careful to follow you all the days of our life, God, because we know that where you guide, you provide. If there be one, Lord, who does not know you, who is struggling to continue their relationship with you, Lord, let them respond in kind, Lord. Let them respond in such a way, God, that shows that, God, that they lay down their own will, their agenda for yours, Lord. That they want to, Lord, essentially change their life, Lord, and begin a lifelong love relationship with you, so that they can begin to walk a life of purpose. Lord, we want to be careful, Lord, to give you praise and glory for all that you're doing, especially the death of your son. You gave the ultimate provision so that we could have the chance to not only hear this sermon, but to act out the very words of God in real time for your kingdom and for your glory. In Jesus, amen.